Do you know which health strategy is better than curing a disease? Do you know which company is precisely working on this methodology in one of the most pressing healthcare issues worldwide? Well, in this video, you're going to find out the answers to both of these questions. Although I have a PhD in biomedical engineering and over 17 years of working experience in the healthcare industry, I do not intend to give you investment advice. Please consider your own risk profile before making any investments and research your investments wisely. So, meet Araclon Biotech, which is a subsidiary of Grifols. And the mission of Araclon Biotech is to specialize in the research and development of methods for the early diagnosis and preventive treatments for Alzheimer's disease. In a future video, we are certainly going to look at their approach to early diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. But in this video, I'd like to focus on their development and actually recently published phase 2 clinical trial data on an active vaccine which aims at preventing Alzheimer's disease or at least delay the onset of symptoms. And this vaccine is called the ABVac40 vaccine. Now, Araclon Biotech is a Spanish biotech company, and specifically the vaccine development, as you can see here, has already gone through the preclinical phase, actually successfully completed the phase 1 clinical phase, where it showed a favorable safety and tolerability profile, while yielding a consistent and specific immune response. And they are now in the phase 2 clinical trial, where the recruitment is now complete, and the clinical trial is scheduled for completion in 2022. And just recently, they published interim clinical data, which we'll take a look at next. Just to be clear, with this particular vaccine, we remain in under the hypothesis that amyloid plaque is a key contributor or perhaps cause of Alzheimer's disease. In fact, the ABVac40 vaccine is actually an active vaccine against the so-called A40 peptide for the preventive treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And, well, those kinds of peptides, there are actually two that are of interest potentially, is basically the A-beta-40 and A-beta-42. And those peptides circulating in the bloodstream can be precursors actually to the formation of amyloid plaques in the brain. So this particular vaccine is targeting actually with antibodies these soluble AB or A-beta-40 peptides as precursors to the amyloid plaque formation. Some clinical research suggests that the A-beta-40 peptides can cause or can contribute to beta amyloid depositions in the walls of certain blood vessels in the brain. And this is causing what is called a cerebral amyloid angiopathy. So ultimately restricted blood flow to certain regions of the brain. And this has been clinically associated with an earlier onset of dementia. So this particular vaccine targeting A-beta-40 and A-beta-42 peptides, precursors to beta amyloid depositions, and this can try to reduce or even prevent the onset of dementia as well as the manifestations of Alzheimer's disease altogether. And as we have seen certainly with regards to the most recent COVID pandemic, being vaccinated, therefore avoiding disease to actually take place in the first place, is a far better strategy than trying to treat a disease once it actually has manifested itself with all the different side effects and profiles. So before we take a closer look at the interim phase 2 clinical trial results, let's head over to clinicaltrials.gov and take a quick look at this particular phase 2 study. So, as I said, this is a study for Alzheimer's patients, or at least those with mild cognitive impairment or very mild Alzheimer's disease. And so what is outlined here is that A-beta peptides are generated from a so-called amyloid precursor protein, APP, And the A-beta 40 peptide is the predominant variant, meaning making up 90% of those peptides. And interestingly enough, many studies have proposed that the concentration of the A-beta protein or peptide in the brain distinguishes patients with Alzheimer's disease from those who simply have senile plaques but are cognitively normal. And this points to the importance of A-beta 40 in the onset of dementia. So, additionally, A-beta 40 is the main component of the amyloid depositions around cerebral arteries, and this is causing the so-called cerebral amyloid angiopathy, leading to reduced blood flow to certain regions of the brain. And this has a prevalence of 80 to 90% in patients who have Alzheimer's disease, and, well, with that also cognitive impairment. So this is why the company is targeting antibodies to basically prevent the deposition of those A-beta 40 proteins in the brain. And they are looking at this from a point of view of a phase 2 study now, since the phase 1 study was successful. They are enrolling 120 patients, and this is a randomized placebo-controlled study. So this study has started actually already in February of 2018, and you can see here that the estimated completion date is in fact December 2022. So, well, almost speaking, around the corner. The primary outcome measure for this study is the incidence of treatment-emergent adverse events. These are indicative, of course, then of safety and tolerability of this particular vaccine, as well as the rate of adverse events comparing the vaccination arm versus the placebo arm. And then the secondary endpoint is the immune response. And they are looking at this over the time frame of 18 months. With that, let's take a look at the interim update that they have provided. So here we're looking at the poster that was given at a recent conference. I leave a link to this poster, of course, in the description below. If we quickly skim over the objectives, we see here that the main objective of this particular presentation is to provide the top-line data of this phase 2 study involving amnestic, mild cognitive impairment patients as well as very mild Alzheimer's disease patients. Now, these patients have received the vaccine, and let's take a look now at the actual, well, safety profile. So let's take a look at the primary and secondary objectives. So here we have the overview of the patient population which was recruited. You can see that we have an age roughly comparable, slightly above 70 years of age in both the vaccination group right here as well as the placebo group. In terms of male and female, we also have here, well, not necessarily a 50-50 split, but quite, well, reasonable. In terms of the PET positive and negative status, we have 92 patients which are PET positive, meaning the amyloid results on the PET scan, and we had 32 patients which were PET negative. Let's take a look now at the primary safety endpoint, because that's really of key importance in these types of studies, and in particularly for a vaccine. So when we look at the primary safety data, we can pretty much see right away that there is no difference seemingly between the vaccination group as well as the placebo group. In terms of overall adverse events, we had 56 versus 60 patients who had any type of adverse event. If we look at those that had adverse events with a treatment cause, we can see here 31 patients in the vaccination group, but also 31 patients in the placebo group. So ultimately no difference between the two. Looking at serious adverse events overall, so not necessarily treatment related, we have here 15 in the vaccination group, 18 in the placebo group, and serious adverse events that are linked to receiving the treatment, well, there were 3 in the vaccination group, and we had 7 in the placebo group. Again, well, that seems to almost suggest that the vaccine actually fared better than the placebo. So this speaks to the excellent safety profile of this particular type of vaccine. So here we're looking at the plasma titers for the anti-A beta 40 or the antibodies against A beta 40 in the blood. And we're comparing placebo group in blue versus the group that received the vaccine. And there's a clear, well, a dose response, but also, of course, a very large difference. This is, by the way, a logarithmic scale, indicating that those patients who received the vaccine, of course, developed the antibodies and had increasing rates as they received multiple shots of the vaccine. So we can in fact see here that over the 24 months, initially those patients have received 5, well, not necessarily back-to-back, but injections of the vaccine with roughly a month's interval in between, then another booster shot here at 10 months. And this again brought up the concentration of the antibody against A beta 40 in the blood quite significantly, and then decreasing again a little bit over time. But even then at 24 months, this is still roughly at, a little bit difficult to see here, but roughly, I would say 500. And if we compare that to the placebo group, well, there is basically hardly any concentration of antibody in the blood, which, makes sense. So in that sense, we can conclude here that the vaccine, in fact, yes, does induce the production of antibodies against this particular protein. And then here we have the conclusions of this interim update. So the repeated administration of the ABVac40 vaccine in patients diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment or very mild Alzheimer's disease demonstrated to be safe and tolerable. And remarkably, there was hardly any incidence of the so-called ARIA-H. Then here, the vaccine induced a strong immune response, which is characterized by an increase in the antibodies and A beta 40 titers that parallels with the increase of total plasma levels in AB beta 40. And, well, they are still analyzing the secondary exploratory endpoints and are ready to actually move to part B of this phase 2 study. So overall, in my opinion, this looks quite promising, and insert is indeed very interesting, because this seems to be, well, at least personally for me, the only approach that actually looks at a vaccine in order to, well, either delay or completely prevent the development of Alzheimer's disease, whereas all other, well, treatments basically look at, okay, a patient has developed Alzheimer's disease, how can we actually treat now the condition that this patient has? And in my opinion, prevention is always much, much better than trying to treat the actual disease. So very interesting to see what comes out of this. So Grifols is a European company, but they are listed on the Nasdaq under the ticker symbol GRFS. And you can see with a market capitalization of $10.9 billion, definitely is a reasonably sized company. Very recently, they just had a uptick in the stock price again, which seems to be linked at least to, according to this website, on rumors of a possible bid from private equity firms to, well, take over the company. Now, I wouldn't place that much emphasis on this particular, well, rumor. It is nothing but a rumor. But nevertheless, stock price, is interesting. I'm not going to go very much into the financials. That's not the point, at least, of this video. If you want me to, of course, I can dive a little bit deeper. But ultimately, what is interesting is, of course, if they manage to bring their vaccine to market, they have a huge addressable market. So combine the vaccine side of their business with another program that they are working on, namely for an in vitro diagnostic to measure certain biomarkers that are indicative of early Alzheimer's disease. Can be potentially quite beneficial to have this company in their portfolio once these two elements, if successful, of course, come commercially to market. You, of course, have to make your own research and due diligence in terms of, the inherent risks you may see in investment in this company. I really just wanted to provide you, the information that these programs exist, that there's a company working actively on a vaccine against Alzheimer's disease. So, if this was of interest to you and you enjoyed this type of video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to my channel.